role at the Diocese of Long Island in looking at some of the histories of our churches. And he's done a tremendous amount of work on this subject at both the educational level and also at the diocesan level. So without further ado, I present to you Craig Townsend.
Thank you all. Thank you all for joining me this evening. It's a delight to get to chat with you. A little bit about who I am and how I've come to this work, I think might be helpful. I have been ordained for 40 years now, which is sort of a shocking number to consider. And half of that ministry was at St. James Church on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, where I led educational programming and also led a grant-funded program for the mentoring of newly ordained clergy. And I retired from there 5 years ago. And shortly after I retired, they took on this work of looking into the history of St. James and its complicity in slavery and the slavery economy. And this was, as some of you have heard, this is a response really to a resolution that was originally passed by the General Convention in 2006, which is a long time ago now. 2006, a General Convention resolution was passed calling on all dioceses to urge their parishes to explore the history of their complicity in slavery and the slavery economy. And not much happened. And that just kind of sat there until our presiding bishop became the new presiding bishop, Michael Curry, came on board, launched the Becoming Beloved Community program, and really sort of renewed the call for this history to be done. I got involved in this because at one point before I started at St. James, I went back to school and did a doctoral program in American religious history at Harvard. And for a dissertation topic, I was looking for a project that would be about a church that in the 19th century, that was my sort of period, was the first half of the 19th century in particular, a church that was in an anomalous relationship with its diocese, because I thought that would open up some interesting things about how the Episcopal Church was working, how its structure worked in that period of sort of coming out of the American Revolution and needing to create a new church. And what were those structures like? And I stumbled across an account of St. Philip's Church, which was the first Black Episcopal church in New York City and only the second in the country after St. Thomas's Church in Philadelphia. And it was a story about how the church was vandalized during the anti-abolitionist riots in New York City in 1834, 7 days of rioting, disrupting efforts to hold meetings of the early meetings of the American Anti-Slavery Society. And at the end of this article I read, it said that St. Philip's Church was not in union with the diocese. And I just thought, well, what does that mean? That can't exist. There's no such thing as an Episcopal church that's not in union with its diocese. All Episcopal churches are part of their diocese. So that got me going. There was the anomalous relationship I was looking for. And I ended up writing about the history of St. Philip's from its founding, its separation from Trinity Church Wall Street in 1809, until it was finally fully accepted into the diocese in 1854, when they were finally allowed to have their delegates attend the diocesan convention. So this period, and particularly, New York City, first half of the 19th century, I've done a lot of research in this area, and that work eventually got published as a book called Faith in Their Own Color, Black Episcopalians in Antebellum New York City. And so that was a great thing. I really enjoyed doing that work, but I was now a priest at St. James, and so much for that. And then I saw this, and I'm going to share screen and I'll just show you what St. James did this research, and this was their response. And this is after I had left them. They put this plaque on the outside of St. James Church. Now, I don't know if you know St. James, but it is literally next door to the Ralph Lauren's flagship store on Madison Avenue. There at the corner of 71st, Ralph Lauren at the corner of 72nd. And this is on the front of the church on Madison Avenue. They put this plaque up. And I really appreciated the wording of this, right? Beginning with the quote from John, Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." But then this phrase, "in solemn remembrance of the enslaved persons whose labor created wealth that made possible the founding of St. James Church, Hamilton Square, 1810. And then just the prayer of the Kyrie eleison, Christ, have mercy. And you can see the date 2019, and they put this plaque up. And this is their first response to learning that the vast majority of the people who founded St. James Church, which began, I always love this, it began in 1810 as a summer parish, right? To think about the Upper East Side as being empty farmland where people went to, spend some summertime away from the city. Just always cracked me up. But those founders, the majority of them, either were slave owners or were profiting from the slavery economy, and that's the money that built the church. So I was really inspired by this this work and by this response to what they'd learned, and I thought I would like to do that. And I am retired, and I have some time, so I'm connected with St. Anne and the Holy Trinity Church in Brooklyn Heights, and I offered to do that history research for them. And so for the COVID year of the academic year of 2020 to 21, I had 6 high school students at St. Anne's School, which is a private school founded by St. Anne's Church, now independent of it. But 6 students working with me. We were online the entire time. We never met in person because of the pandemic. And we did this research into the history of St. Anne's Church and of Holy Trinity, which it's St. Anne and the Holy Trinity is not actually a merged parish. Holy Trinity was disbanded during the McCarthy era in the 1950s. And St. Anne's moved into their building and added the name on and invited that congregation, those who were still around, to come back in the late 70s. So I looked at the history of these 2 parishes with these students, and I'll show you this, which is this is a list of the wardens, vestry members, diocesan delegates of St. Anne's Church in its earliest years. And you can see this column here and how many of them were slave owners. 26 out of 47 we could demonstrate were owners of enslaved persons. And that's pretty shocking. But the piece of this that I've come to think is really important, and I have to say as a historian, I can't quite figure out how to get at this, but 26 out of 47, that's a lot, right? But that means 21 of these leaders did not own slaves. And that's actually a choice that they made, right? I mean, these leaders, it's pretty clear from that period, these were all well-to-do gentlemen. They're all men, of course, from that period. Every one of them could have afforded to own slaves. So 21 of these people chose not to be part of that institution and part of that practice. And that both of those choices, to do so and to not do so, have really become powerful emblems for me that I really want to explore. So I did this work with St. Anne and the Holy Trinity. We presented our findings to the parish, and then I called the diocese. I talked to Canon Woodley at the diocese, who I've known forever, and I said, who else is doing this work in the diocese? And she told me about a couple of churches that were already doing some of this research. One being Zion Church in Douglaston, Queens, and the other is represented here with us tonight by Mary Beth Mills Curran. St. John's in Cold Spring Harbor was doing some of this research. And So I connected with them, but I said to Canon Woodley, is anyone kind of riding herd on this for the diocese? And she said, well, she put it, I'm supposed to be, and I have too many other things I'm doing, so it's not really happening. And so I said, well, I'd be really interested. And she said, great, write a proposal. So now I have this job. And I got this fancy title out of it, which I do have to say I really enjoy. I be the historian in residence for racial justice for the Diocese of Long Island. And so this work that I did years ago, literally 20 years ago, has come back, and I'm working again in this historical field that I'm fascinated by, a period that I'm familiar with, and I'm really excited to be doing this work. My job is not to do the research for every church. My job is to help members of each church do the research they want and need to do. And that's what I'm here for, is to try to encourage you, along with 45 churches in the Diocese of Long Island that existed, that were founded either before the Civil War. I'm really using a cutoff date of 1870, because even those founded right after the Civil War are going to be people who have probably had there are going to be some people who had involvement in the slavery economy, right? Slavery in New York State ended in 1827. So prior to that period, we were looking for, people not just involved in the slavery economy, but involved in actually enslaving people. After that period, we're looking for what people did, how they made their livings, and whether that they were profiting off the slavery economy, and whether that therefore was the money they were giving to the church came from that source. And so, as I say, there are all these churches that I'm encouraging to do this, and it's hard. It's hard to do this. And that's why I really want us to pay attention to both sides of this equation, because we want to look for that history of complicity in slavery and the slavery economy. But we also want to carefully pay attention to the people who were choosing not to do that. And in particular, we want to know, were there parishioners who were involved in anti-slavery activities? Members of the American Anti-Slavery Society, more specifically, more locally, members of the New York Manumission Society that argued to encourage people to free their enslaved persons. So we're looking for both sides of this equation. And I like to tell the story that one of the things we discovered at St. Anne's is that many of the streets around the church in Brooklyn Heights are named for the original families, the original family farms that were there. And they were, at some various points, the village made these families, put a street through along the edge of their farm, and they made them name it after themselves. There's a street in Brooklyn Heights called Gerolman, Tunis Gerolman, clearly a Dutchman, had this farm. He did not want to put a road through his farm, and the village made him. He did not want to name it after himself, and the village made him. And he really didn't want it to intersect with Clinton Street, which was named for the governor, DeWitt Clinton, who built the Erie Canal, which Tunis Gerolman referred to as the Big Ditch, and despised everything about DeWitt Clinton. So he lost on all three counts. He had to build a street. He had to have it named for himself, and it did intersect with Clinton. But we discovered that all of these streets, right, the vast majority of them are named for families that enslaved people. But the most intriguing one is Hicks Street. Hicks Street is a major street running through Brooklyn Heights, and really running south through Cobble Hill and all the way down through Carroll Gardens, etc. And it was named for the Hicks family. Most of the Hicks family were Quakers. And at one point, the Brooklyn Quaker meeting actually split because Elias Hicks did not think that the Brooklyn Quaker meeting was being sufficiently anti-slavery. So he led a group out of the Brooklyn Friends meeting and started a new one, and they became known as the Hicksite Quakers, and they were abolitionists. And I'm just really intrigued because there are two Hicks who were brothers, John and Jacob Hicks, who were members of St. Anne's Church. They were not Quakers, they were Episcopalians, and they were both slave owners. And I really wonder what Thanksgiving gatherings were like for that family when the Quakers and the Episcopalians got together. It has to have been wild. But that's where I think we need to, again, pay attention to the fact that there's a lot more going on than just this one simple search. The more we dig into these histories, the more complicated they become. And that seems to me only right, because human beings are pretty darn complicated. So what I'd like to do is show you some of the kinds of work that I've been doing. So I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm going to call up this slideshow. I have to move this, and then I can do that. So here we go. Uncovering Parish Histories is the name of this project, and this is First Steps for Research. And I do want to point out that I have an assistant, young man named Brian Clark, volunteered right at the beginning to assist. He wanted to work on this project. He came on as a volunteer, and he was in his last semester of college, and the bishop decided he should get paid for the work he's doing, which I was thrilled to hear. So he graduated this spring. He's been looking for a job all summer and fall. He's landed a job. He's starting up any day now. And nonetheless, he said he wants to keep working with me as many hours as he can squeeze in, which I'm delighted, because he's done some really great work. So I just wanted to give a little shout out there to Brian Clark. He's done some great work with me. Here's the project. Here are the goals. To find out whether early members of parish enslaved people. Straightforward, right? To find out whether early members of the parish profited from the slavery economy. And to clarify that through investments or other commercial connections with Northern and/or Southern slavery. New York City, there's been a lot of work done over the last 20 years on the economic history of slavery. And it's pretty clearly demonstrated that New York City became the financial capital of this country because of the amount of money running through New York, banks, insurance companies, etc., that were making loans to Southern plantation owners, and then to buy more land, or purchase more slaves, grow more cotton, ship it all up here to New York, and from here it got shipped out to all parts of the country and across, mostly a lot of it across the Atlantic. But this became the financial clearinghouse, and there's some really good work done on this, and it's really hard actually to picture anyone who lived in New York City in this period, and therefore probably in the environs, who wasn't in some way at least involved in the slavery economy. Because if you think about it, if you were wearing clothing in the first half of the 19th century, you were probably wearing some cotton clothing, and therefore you were wearing a product of enslaved persons. If you were eating food, at some point you were probably putting sugar on that food, and so you were eating a product of enslaved persons, right? You could not actually escape in that period being involved in some way with the slavery economy. The questions that I'm looking into are, what are the ways in which people profited from that? Bankers, insurance company directors, they were making investments, they were making loans, they were making their living off of those loans, etc. So we're looking for that kind of thing. Simple as at St. Anne's, we found two people who had dry goods stores. Well, that means they're selling cotton, tobacco, sugar, rum, rope made from either hemp or cotton. All of those are produced by enslaved persons. So even something as simple as having a store, you were making your living off of these products. So that's the complicated part here. but also to find out whether any early parishioners were involved in anti-slavery activism. And then another piece to find out whether any parish connections can lead us to new knowledge about enslaved persons in our communities, persons largely lost to history. And here I want to give a little shout out to Mary Beth at St. John's in Cold Spring Harbor, because she and some of the people that they've been working on this research are the ones who discovered that slavery ended in 1827. It was because of a law was passed in 1799, the Gradual Emancipation Law. In 1799, they declared that any child born to enslaved parents was born free, but they had to serve their parents' owner as indentured servants for either 26 or 28 years, depending on whether they were male or female. Well, what that meant is that every one of those births had to be registered in order to keep track of the 26 or 28 years that they needed to be indentured, which means that there's this period from 1799 on where New York birth records are recording the names of enslaved parents who are having children born. And this is a really exciting development, because it means that there is a source for first and last names for enslaved persons that we can track. And so if we can make some connections with that to our parishes, we're opening up some really interesting and important new realms of research. So I really wanted to lift that up here. I'm going to come back to this image here. I'll show you where it comes from. So the first thing you do is you find records, vestry minutes and parish registers for the earliest years of the parish, right? As I understand it, your earliest records are held by the Huntington Historical Society, and so we need to, work out getting access to them. This is actually the cover or the first page of the Register of St. Anne's Church. So it contained things beginning in 1784 when 1787 when St. Anne's was incorporated. Because what you're looking for is to compile a list of names, right? So these are your best sources. Also, is there a written or even a published history of the parish? Here's a historical sketch of Holy Trinity, from which we were able to get the names of all the early vestry members of that church. We were very fortunate that St. Anne's Church actually had a history written in 1845 that at the back had a list of every communicant from its beginning until 1845, which was a really great source of information. If you don't have any of those things, then we explore other options. And even if you do, we'll explore other options. But I know that St. John's does, so we'd start with the records that you've got. You compile a list of names of parishioners with their known church connections and dates. When were they on the vestry? Did they report to the vestry about something? Anything you can do that pins down what's their connection to the parish and roughly when. That gives us some ways to do some further research on all of them, all right? Then from the vestry minutes, you can collect the names, which is, going to be, again, all male, but you get names that, again, we can then explore further. But you also have a really clear sense of these are the leaders of the parish. So compiling that list of names, wardens, vestrymen, the dates of their service. Sometimes vestry minutes will record those who ran for election but were not elected. Those two are going to be people that were understood to be leaders of the parish. And then anyone else who's mentioned in the minutes for any reason, because it'll often be people making reports to the vestry, etc. So again, what you're trying to do is populate the early years of your parish, because most church histories simply write about the clergy and the building, and they're not all that interesting. So finding out who the people were and what they were doing is actually really fascinating work. From parish registers, you start with confirmation and communicant lists, because those are the active parishioners. And this is actually from St. George's Church in Brooklyn. And just the handwriting of the 19th century is so fabulous. But this is where, you're not going to get confirmed if you're not an active member. So confirmation lists are great. Plus, you get all these women's names, which is really great. It is a truism in American religious history that 2/3 to 3/4 of the active members of any church are women. Always have been, still true. But for most of our history, women were not allowed positions of leadership. And so trying to restore some of these early women to the story, I think is really, really important. So we're looking for these names. Add them to the list, add the dates of when they were confirmed, because that gives you, some sense that they are early adulthood, maybe later adulthood, but they're making a choice here. Then look for those names, these names, in the marriage, baptism, and funeral listings to see if you can add some family members, right? Who else is in the family? Because the thing is that we don't know in marriages, baptisms, and funerals if they're all active members or not. So starting with the ones that you've got, or anywhere else where you have evidence of attachment to the parish, and then looking for them in there to see if you can add more family members to the list. Great, right? Here's if there's a history of parish, look for a list of communicants, founding vestor members, or any other names that can be compiled. And this is actually that list from St. Anne's history from 1845. Here are all these communicants listed from 1788 on, which was just a fantastic list to work with. Okay, then if the parish was founded before 1827, the end of legal slavery, then you look up all the names dated before 1827 on this database, NESRI, the Northeast Slavery Records Index. This began as the New York Slavery Records Index. It was started by 2 professors at John Jay College here in Brooklyn, and it's just been a series of their graduate students working with them, compiling records. At this point, they say they've compiled over 40,000 records, and it's absolutely fantastic. Now, I'm going to send you, when I'm done, the PDF of this slideshow, and even on the PDF, this is a link, so you can just click on it. So let me show you that. Here's the Northeast Slavery Records Index database, and it's fantastic. So you go here to search instructions, and then you go to here, general search. And we're going to click New York because that's what we're looking at. Now, Heather Kress sent me a list of some names. She didn't know if they're actually connected to the parish of St. John's or not, but they're from town records, right? So she sent me this list of names. There's some pretty interesting names on here. Just because I like it so much, there's Ananias Carl. What a great name. So if we go to the Slavery Index and we just type in Carl as a last name, well, there you go. And look, here's Ananias Carl living in Huntington, one enslaved person in his household, according to the 1790 census. It's that easy and that hard because people spelled their names in all sorts of different ways, and you have to get the spelling correct in order for the record to come up. So sometimes you have to think about other ways to spell a name, because in the early 19th century, really name spellings were all over the place. Here it's Carl, C-A-R-L-L. This pretty quickly becomes C-A-R-L-E, right? So it's hard to know, but here you are, right? And here's a Jacob Carl in Huntington, and Israel Carl in Huntington, Gilbert Carl in Huntington. Are they all related? That would be good to know, right? So this database is absolutely invaluable. And so that's the first thing, is you just start working through that, right? And as I say, keep a list of those who were not slave owners as well. These are people who chose not to participate in this practice, right? And we'll come back to the Manumission Society and anti-slavery movements momentarily. Okay, and then whenever your parish was founded, whether, so for the post 1827, but even before then, all of those names and this is where the more volunteers, the better, because there's a lot of slogging around. Research the names. If you have an Ancestry.com account already, great. But I use Family Search because it's free. So, but if you already have an Ancestry.com, I think they're really, I think at this point, owned by the same people. They're all run by the Mormons. But you want to look for family members, particularly post-slavery, post-1827. You want to look for parents and grandparents. Did these people grow up, who are members of the parish still, did they grow up in households that used to hold slaves before slavery was outlawed, right? Who are their family members? And again, running them through this database, how were they involved? You're going to find ship captains who were running slave ships, etc. I mean, it's worth pursuing. Another place to look is findagrave.com. You can find where somebody was buried, and it'll often have some family information there too. You can be able to find previous generations. So then you look up those parents. Sorry, question?
Okay. We got some comments in the chat that I just want to call your attention to.
Cool, thanks.
Not a problem.
All right, I have to stop sharing it to look at them, I think. Let me pause that for a moment. Questions. Is the Nesri database comprehensive? It's vast, but I don't think you can consider it definitive, actually. That's a really good question. It is, so you can't say if they don't come up that they definitely weren't slave owners, but it's a pretty good chance. It's a pretty good chance, I think, is the best way to put it. Oh, yeah, good point about the library offering free access to Ancestry. So that's good. And Mary Beth is pointing out that there is a living descendant of the enslaved Carls at Oyster Bay. So yeah, you guys are going to definitely want to coordinate some of your work because I think you're going to find some pretty interesting overlap. Good, thank you. All right, back to here. Okay, so we're looking at parents and grandparents to see if any early members grew up in a household with enslaved persons before slavery ended. The other thing, and this, I'll show you what I've been able to find, but find a local town or city directory. And I'm hoping maybe the Huntington Historical Society would have some. And then you can look up names and addresses, which will give, because they give occupations in directories back in those days. So then we can start to make some calls about how they were making their living. All right. And if let's see, pause this for a second. For example, let's see, where did I put that? I have some good links here, and I found this. All right, this is a Huntington directory from 1868. Well, that's a little late to be too much use to us, but worth exploring. But that's the first thing I could find online. I'm hoping there's earlier ones. Right? That's the kind of thing that a historical society should be able to help us with. So I just wanted to show you that. Look, here's somebody with a dry goods store. Now we're post-Civil War, so they're not in products of slavery anymore, but not too many years earlier, they would have been. So there's a good chance, right? So that's the kind of thing there we're looking for there. All right. Back over here. Okay. Looking up all of these names, including ancestors and children on websites for the New York Manumission Society and American Abolitionists to see if early members were anti-slavery activists. This is actually a handwritten page of members of the New York Manumission Society, which is one of the stranger things from our perspective. It's just the perfect kind of thing to get our heads into the weirdness of other periods of history. The New York Manumission Society was started by John Jay, who was the first governor of New York and the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he tried to get it written into New York State's Constitution that slavery would be illegal, and he failed. So he started the New York Manumission Society to be, people encouraging others to free their enslaved persons. right? And it's quite a list of names. It's a pretty impressive group. The vast majority of them actually were slave owners, including John Jay himself. He owned slaves until the day he died, despite being president of the New York and founder of the New York Manumission Society. I don't know how to make sense of that, but there it is, right? It's just sort of a remarkable thing. The top name on here is Aquila Giles, and Aquila Giles was a member of St. Anne's Church, and he was a member of the Manumission Society, and he owned a farm in Maryland as well as living here in New York. And on that farm, he had 7 enslaved persons. You know, it's just a remarkable thing. So they were activists for ending slavery, even as they were slave owners. So if you click on, again, these are all links. This takes you to those images and some other, and I'll show you there's some other sources of even more information on the Manumission Society. And if you click on American Abolitionists, it takes you to the American Abolitionists and Anti-Slavery Activists. This is not as good a list as I would like to find. So I'm continuing to work on a more definitive list of the members of the American Anti-Slavery Society, because they were legion, but a lot of them didn't really want their friends and family to, you know, their neighbors to know that they were activists. So it's proving to be difficult to get that kind of list. Okay. Looking for other sources of information if your cupboard happened to be bare, but yours is not. Looking into local newspapers, of course, looking for announcements of births and marriages and obituaries that involve the parish or names you've already connected to the parish. That's another great place to get information. Local birth records, as I said, especially for registration of those born to enslaved parents, right? Then other sources of information. And here I use this because it just kind of amazes me. This is a painting by Francis Guy that, and you know, it's just totally blanked on what year it is. But anyway, it's Brooklyn in winter. It's a Brooklyn scene in winter. And he's basically looking out his window at the corners of Water and Front Streets in Brooklyn Heights now, and painting what he sees. And back here, it turns out is St. Anne's Church. But because the interesting thing about this is there's a key to it that tells you who every person in here is and what all the buildings are. And so that little thing in the back here, number 7, is St. Anne's Church, right? So that's kind of fun. Whoops, wrong way, sorry. Right? Back there is actually St. Anne's Church, all these buildings. But here's one of the Hicks brothers carrying a goose. You know, but up here, this figure clearly cleaning the chimney, well, that would be Samuel Foster, Negro. Is he an enslaved person or free person? Don't know, right? We also have another one, 33 over here, Abiel Titus's Negro servant, Jeff. And again, as I was saying, it's hard to track enslaved persons because mostly in any record, just like this, they only have first names. So the fact that Samuel Foster has 2 names means we could actually track who that person is. But following Jeff is pretty difficult when that's the only name you have. But nonetheless, so you never know. Are there plaques in the church that list early members, etc.? Where can you find information that will give you some names? Local histories. Is your parish mentioned? Here's a history of Kings County that turned out to be invaluable for us in finding out. It listed board members of banks and insurance companies, the years they were founded. So all of a sudden we could name people who were on those boards, right? So again, another good source. Now, this is a really key part for me. It's really important to do this as a group because this is really hard. If you're interested in history the way I am, this kind of research, I love this kind of digging into early records and pulling, you know, and then I go, I got it. Oh yeah, I just proved another person was a slave owner. It is really hard work. St. Anne's Church is the first Episcopal church in Brooklyn. It started with a group of people meeting in the living room of Joshua and Ann Sands. And there is still a Sands Street in Brooklyn Heights. And they gathered this community, and after 3 or 4 years, they incorporated, built a building, and they chose Anne as the patron saint in order to honor Ann Sands for hosting those first gatherings, for creating the Sunday school and running it, for all that she'd done to get things started. They chose Anne as their patron saint. And one of my students doing the research, we just randomly assigned names, and we would, take 5 or 6 names at a time and just look them up and come back a week later and report to each other online. And one of my students came online and she said, my school is named for a slave owner because Joshua and Ann Sands enslaved 3 persons. It's really hard to learn some of these things. And it really matters to be doing it with a group, to have someone to talk to pray with, to talk about how it feels. It's really difficult information we're learning, which is why I think it's also just pastorally, it's really important to think about the people that you're learning who were not enslaving people, who were making those choices. If you find people who were actually actively anti-slavery, you got to hold on to the fact that it's a complicated picture, but it is really hard work. And I just really urge everyone to care for each other, right? Because I think that's really important. It's also really important to remember that you're not in this alone. And that's why this website was created for me and the work that we're doing, uncovering parish histories, right? There are 45 churches that are on the list that need to do this work. At this point, I'm in contact in one way or another with about 20 of them. Many are pretty active in this work, and many are just getting started. If you go to this website, then edliparishhistories.org, right? You can see some of the work we're doing, right? There's reference to the 2006. There's Brian Clark and I doing a little talk about what we're doing. Upcoming events. Why, look, the historian in residence is speaking at St. John's in Huntington soon. Right? But that kind of stuff I'm putting on here so that people can see. But here's a map, and every one of those markers is a parish that existed prior to the Civil War or just after, and therefore I'm hoping to involve in doing this work. So every one of these, look, there you are, right? Every one of these. So I think it's important to know that other churches are doing this, that we're all in this together, that the object here is not to beat ourselves up, okay? The object here is to talk about who we were, acknowledge the reality of that, and then talk about how to move forward. How do we acknowledge that truth and then say, but that's not who we are now. That's not who we are now. Who do we want to be now? How do we want to be involved with that, right? So the line that I keep using, it's become my motto. You can't take a credible stand for racial justice unless you know the history of your involvement as an institution in racial injustice. But once you do, then you can say, we know that, but this is where we're going now. And I think that's really, really important, to see this work as pointing ourselves forward toward what we want to do for racial justice, how we want to be active in that, in seeing, all of God's children as deserving of the same treatment of the rest of God's children. I think that's absolutely the key. So that's why I'm doing this work. That's why I'm calling on others to do this work. Let me take a quick look here in the chat. History of the church, admitted into the church, yes. And that's really important. What can we learn about these people who may have been admitted to worship in the church? Where they, there are communicants, there are people listed as communicants in that 1845 history of St. Anne's. There are 3 or 4 people who are listed as Negro or colored, right? Does that mean they're worshiping in the midst? It sure sounds like it. So, yeah, I think whatever we can learn about, each particular parish. My goal is for each church to do this work. I will support you in every way that I can. I will help you find resources, et cetera, et cetera. I will come and sit down and meet with you and talk through all of this stuff. Anything I can do to get churches to do this. And then ideally produce a report to the church congregation about what you've learned, and then give it to me. Because what I want to do is put together a diocesan-wide picture. What can we say about the diocese as a whole, given what each parish has learned? So that the diocese as a whole, again, can take a credible stand for racial justice, because it is acknowledging its history of racial injustice. And ideally, its history of previous activism for racial justice as well. So I want to compile all of that into one large picture. But I want to do that by helping each parish find their picture, put it together. Who were you then? Who do you want to be now? Who do you want to be going forward? Right? So that's what I'm up to. As I say, I think it's really important work. I find it really exciting because this is the kind of history that I do find really fascinating. I find it really difficult, but I'm also, as I say, really encouraged to think about the choices people were making then and the extent to which we can learn anything about who they were and what their lives looked like, is to, make our parish founders come alive. And I think that's pretty exciting, actually. So I see, Allison, can I speak about anything I've learned about lives of enslaved people who worship in these churches? We're finding some specifics church by church. We're looking into, so one of the questions, did they have, were there balconies where people were made to sit? I don't know. We haven't been able to find the architecture of the original St. Anne's Church yet. We're working on that. But we do have accounts of people bringing their servants, both enslaved and free, to church at St. Anne's. So where were they sitting, right? So I think that's pretty interesting. Mary Beth, I appreciate your chat. And Allison, that's RCW, that's Rob, is that correct? Some more information about this history would be great.
Oh, that's Rob Wheeler.
Okay.
I didn't realize it was Rob Wheeler.
That's correct. Yeah. Thank you.
Rob, that is like super, 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 super important what you just put in the chat.
Yeah.
Because the first African-American poet published in the United States is a man named Jupiter Hammond, who was enslaved by Henry Lloyd.
Right.
Yeah. So there you go. So we're making some really powerful connections. And that's what I'm saying. The more we can connect to each other and start to flesh out these stories, right? It's really powerful. So if you've got a history of the church, that's going to be a fantastic source. If you can, put together some volunteers that want to take this on, talk to people at the Historical Society, get access to early records, see if they've got directories, you can be off and running in no time. There is no deadline to this work. Okay. I originally proposed my position as a 3-year position. 3 academic years. This is my second year, so I'll be around at least through next year. If there's more work to do, which I suspect there will be, whether the bishop is paying me or whether I'm some sort of just, freelance consultant, whatever, I'm going to still be available to help people doing this work. So, it took me and 6 high school students a full year, academic year, to do the work at St. Anne and the Holy Trinity. Just, as a ballpark way of thinking about it. So, don't think this is going to happen in a couple of months. It just, there's a lot of just slogging legwork there to be done. But I'm hoping that some of you will be inspired to take this on.
Rick,
Any
can I
other
ask a question?
questions?
Can I
Yeah.
ask a question? Yeah, we have a cemetery that is a parishioner-only cemetery. And we have not only lists of people, but we can see by the size of the stones that they put above their graves, how prominent the people were.
Mhm.
How much are cemeteries used, and in what ways do you think we can use that?
Yeah, and James sent me the spreadsheet of the list you're starting to compile from that. And I have to say, I'm very intrigued that just sort of randomly putting in some of those names that are, either pre or sufficiently close to 1827, that I thought there would be a chance they could be slave owners. I did not find any. And that's really intriguing because, you could well, therefore, have a bunch of folks. You're going to have a bunch of members of your parish who were not slave owners. And how prominent were they? What kind of leadership? Were they active about that in ways? Were they vocal about the choices they made? I think you're going to have some really interesting ways to go there. Yeah, the more information you can find about those people, it's so great. The spreadsheet, you've got birth and death dates. Great. You can go nuts on Ancestry or Family Search and build out families, start to find relationships, who are the brothers, who are the uncles, who are the, aunts and grandmothers. And that's just more names that you're going to be able to look up in these places. Yeah. Gladys. Yes. Gladys, great. Thank you. She wants to be involved. Excellent.
Well, I told Heather, and
Yeah.
Let's see how far I get with my to-do list. But I remember
Okay.
I've been on your seminars. You're wonderful.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. And yeah, so whatever I say, as I say, whatever I can do to help you get started, support you along the way, just give me a yell. All right.
Do you want my email?
Why don't we do that at your end? Maybe Duncan, James, do you guys want to?
We are compiling a list of people who are going to be on a committee to do this work. Gladys,
There
we
we
will
go.
take your name. You'll be along with a whole bunch of other people. Next Tuesday, we're going to see the actual history of St. John's with some specific data about our church. Ken Quinn is our historian, and he is researching right now, and he's going to give us some real specifics. In the meantime, we're going to get together with the town historian, and we're going to look at some of that information. They did a whole kind of area of the museum on St. John's about a year and a half ago. Rob was involved in that with some really interesting things. So we're going to get back to them and see if we can't get some of that back out again. They have done a lot of work in this area and are moving forward in ways. And in 2 weeks, Robert Hughes is going to do some work as to what we're doing in Huntington as a town. They're going to do a slave museum, and maybe some people want to be involved in that. And if you've never put a museum together, it is a fascinating job that is really a lot of fun and something that can last for, a century, for decades at least. And it is really wonderful work if you're really interested in this type of thing. In Huntington, they're always looking for volunteers to do that.
And Robert Hughes has just been doing some fantastic work on all of this. And I did get to watch the recording of the talk that he that he gave that you for you guys, and I've made a link to it on my website. You'll see that there.
Right. Are there any more questions? We have about 2 minutes. We're going to close at on the hour with a prayer by our deacon Claire. But last chance, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can just speak up. All right, Craig, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about all this, and I look forward to working with you.
Thank you.
Claire.
The Lord be with you. Lord God, thank you for bringing us together this evening to look with new eyes at the history of our beloved church, a history that connects us to our historical involvement with slavery. We thank you for all those doing the difficult and painful work of uncovering our sins. Thank you for your abundant love and care for us, for forgiving our sins, even for the sins we do not realize we commit. Lord, please fill us with your wisdom and your compassion for our entire human family. May you bless us with your never-ending love. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thanks, James and Liz and Claire, for helping out with evening prayer.
Thank you all.
Good night, everybody.